now we shift to more difficult topics that maybe I love even more about something that you write in your work, in your book, Israelite Religions, some arguments that points to 13th century evidence from Emar that supports the early origins of what is conventionally referred to as the priestly source, P. So could you share more about these parallels?
Yeah. No, this is it's so interesting. This is a site, the modern name of it is Tel Meskene. It's near a later classical site on the Euphrates River in what is today Syria, north, well north of Mari and east of what would be the modern day town of Aleppo. It lies on the Euphrates River. It was occupied, and more discoveries have found more periods, but the main period we're interested in is the 13th century BC, and the occupation of that time may go back to the 14th century BC as well. And this is a time when to the north there is the great empire of the Hittites. So there's some Hittite influence on this. To the west there is Ugarit, and so this is an international time of trade and exchange. But Amar itself seems to be much more agricultural. They have fields and other things, and that seems to be how they make their living. I'm sure there is trade involved being on the Euphrates River and going up and down the Euphrates, but that doesn't seem to have as dominant a role. And this is important because Amar is an inland city, and it is a city made up of people who, by studying the names of these people, we have hundreds and hundreds of names of people who lived in Amar at that time, from contracts, witnesses, special types of economic and other texts that you would have in a city of that age. The names are dominantly West Semitic, which means they are in the same culture as the Canaanites and the Israelites and so forth. And that's important too, because that means that the culture of this area is not really as much related to the Babylonian and Assyrian cultures to the east, or even the Hittites to the north, but is more closely related to places like Ugarit, but also Israel. And so this was interesting. As the site was excavated back in the 70s and 80s, and in the 1980s, by that time they had discovered a lot of texts or tablets that were related to religious practices at Amar from the 13th century BC. So we have that. And then, of course, we know, or we believe, at least I do, that Israel at that time was just forming as a nation as Moses was leading Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus, and that the way it's portrayed in the Bible, so much of the law and practice, ceremonial practices and so forth, that are found in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So much of this comes from this time, or originates at this time. Now, of course, in the Bible, it's revealed by God, and there are special things to this which are different than anywhere else. You have God saving his people and redeeming them and bringing them out of the in the Exodus. So they're redeemed from Egypt, and we often associate, and rightly so, the Passover and then the days of unleavened bread that follow that as celebrating this event. But it also, and you see this in the cultic discussions, like in Leviticus 23, also in some of the other texts, Deuteronomy 16 and Exodus 34, you see that the Passover is also a time when the first harvest of the barley is brought before the Lord and given to him as the first fruits. And then there is a time of eating unleavened barley bread in the days of unleavened bread that follow that. This remembers that the people left Egypt very quickly, so they didn't have time to cook the bread. but it is also a time of remembering and giving thanks for the barley harvest, which is the main source of food for the people. So these all connect. Now, we go to Emar, and we find a similar grain harvest. And we find one called the Zukru Festival. The Zukru Festival, it comes from the West Semitic root ZKR, which means to remember. And of course, in the Passover, people remember what God has done. Now, at Emar, they don't remember any work of God, but what it does seem to be, well, except insofar as they recognize that they also receive grain from God, their God, they worship a different God, but that connection is made, and with it are many things that are similar to the Passover. It takes place in the middle day of the month. It takes place especially at twilight, when a number of the rituals and other things occur. It is followed by these 7 days, a 7-day festival or event. There is special bread, just like the barley bread and the unleavened bread in Israel. There is the roasting of meat, and particularly a lamb, just like in Israel. There are too many parallels and similarities to say this is accidental. It's very likely connected with the harvesting of grain, but what it shows, I believe, is that Israel, when it was given the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it already knew of this in its culture, of these kinds of festivals, but now they were going to be infused with new meaning. And the meaning they were infused with or given was the basic redemption by God of Israel. And Emar knows nothing about that in its festival. But what we see is already in the 13th century. In other words, they didn't have to wait until the 7th century BC in Josiah. A lot of people argued that all of this is late, and that, yes, maybe there was a feast of Passover where they roasted, or some sort of feast where they roasted a lamb, but that was the nomadic people. They had lambs and they roasted lambs. And then maybe there was a feast celebrating the barley and the harvest, but that was the settled people in the Canaanite cities of Jerusalem. And it's only much later, during the time of, say, Josiah in 622 BC in the 7th century, that, or even later, that these two faiths came together and were understood as related to one another. And then they kind of developed this story about the Exodus. But now we see that this was already going on in the 13th century BC. So Israel didn't have to wait until the 7th century to learn about this. No, they already knew about it, and there was nothing surprising about celebrating and roasting a lamb and having bread and connecting this with the harvest, but now also to be connected with the Exodus. Then you have the description in Exodus 29 and in also Leviticus 8 and 9 about the installation of the priests, particularly. We would call them the high priests now, but in those days they only had in Leviticus 1 or 2 priests. So they were going to be installed for the first time, and we see there that they are anointed with oil as part of the ritual of installing them. In fact, the word for anoint is mashach in Hebrew, and the word to be anointed or anointed one is Mashiach, from which we get the word Messiah. And in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, where you have a big emphasis on priests and you don't have a king yet in Israel, in that's the most common use of the word Messiah, or its various forms, is for the priest. Then you come into the historical books and the rise of the king, Saul and then David, and then you come into the prophecies and the Psalms as well. And here, whenever they speak of Mashiach, anointed one, they're talking about the king. Now, for many, many years, as people studied the ancient Near East, they saw that the king in other cultures was anointed, and this went way back in the 14th century BC. One of the states in Syria speaks of anointing a king. So we know that the kings were anointed with oil. That was part of a ritual that was common. And so when you read about the kings be anointed with oil in the historical books and things, that's no surprise. But no priest was ever anointed with oil. And so what a number of scholars did was they came up with the idea that, well, if anointing with oil makes you a king, and we know after Israel is taken into exile, excuse me, and then during the Persian period, the king was the Persian emperor, Cyrus or Darius or Xerxes. The people were allowed to return to their homeland, but they were not allowed to have a king. So the theory is these priestly writings, because they're so late, they came up with this idea that they would anoint the high priest, and by doing that, they would recognize the high priest as the leader or king. And we know that in this period, in the post-exilic period, the high priest had a very influential role and sometimes was the major leader of the people. But this was all then assumed because we had no evidence of priests ever being anointed outside of the Bible. Well, then we discovered the Emar texts in the 1980s. And at the end of that period, into the 1990s, we have the publication of this material, and we find that the high priestess actually is a woman who is appointed as the leader and priest of the people before the storm god at that time in Emar was anointed with oil. It was a 7-day ritual, just like in Leviticus, and some of the same kinds of things went on. And at a point in that ritual, she is anointed with oil as part of her office of priest. Now, that's very important because it shows that the anointing of a priest with oil was not unique to Israel. It was known elsewhere. And in fact, it was known at Emar in this society in the 13th century BC. So if you are going to look at a text like Leviticus 8 and 9, where you have a priestly figure being anointed with oil, and you knew and studied the ancient Near East, where would you date that or place that? Well, the place that is closest in terms of parallel is the 13th century BC, the time of Moses, not the exilic and post-exilic, not the 6th or 5th centuries or even the 7th century BC. And so again, we have very interesting evidence that that is, in some ways, it's amazing because now we know that that was going on in the time of Moses. Now, of course, the significance of the role of the priest and everything is different in Israel than elsewhere. But the idea of somebody who serves before a god or goddess and who does that special work was known in every culture. And that this person would be anointed with oil, we now know to have taken place. Another interesting parallel or connection with the account there in Leviticus, you remember that story in Leviticus 10, how two of the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, come into the temple or into the tabernacle and offer strange fire. And this word for strange, zerah, has been discussed and discussed and discussed, and what it may mean. And so I was very interested when I read the installation of the priestess at Emar. And what I learned was that when I looked at that not on the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, but on the seventh and last day, there's a special ritual that takes place with fire, and only on that day. Then I went back and I looked at Leviticus, and I wonder whether what Nadav and Abihu were doing, not that they knew of the city of Emar, but that this kind of ritual was known, and if they were attempting to somehow incorporate elements of this ritual into their own installation as priest, and therefore they were bringing fire into the tabernacle, which was not authorized by God. And so we see that although there are forms of the ceremonies and other things that are used and adapted, it's nevertheless not simply taking over wholesale, but in fact, it's very important to follow exactly what God said. And so when they brought strange fire into the tabernacle, God could not tolerate or allow that. And they died as a result of that. And of their falsehood. But it's an interesting fact that we have this going on in this other pagan ritual from the same time. The other sort of interesting connection is on a broader level. In Exodus 24, 34, Leviticus 23, Numbers 28, 29, and also Deuteronomy 16, I believe, we have what sometimes scholars call cultic calendars. That is, they set out the major feasts, when they are to be celebrated, and with various amounts of detail, how they are to be celebrated and what's to be done. And they cover the period from the Passover all through Pentecost, through into the fall, and the events of the Day of Atonement, the New Year's Day, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, as people celebrate the coming in the harvest of the fruits and vegetables, of things like the grapes and so forth, which is usually September, October in our reckoning of months. So it covers 6 months or more of these feasts, 6, 7 months. And until the discoveries at Emar, we had no calendar in the ancient Near East, certainly no calendar of Babylonia or Assyria or the Hittites or even Ugarit. They had one that was a couple months, but they had no calendar that covered that much period, that long a period of time, 6, 7 months. And then they discovered that the calendar, the cultic calendar at Emar, and it covered 6 months, 7 months. It went from the fall to the spring, whereas the one in Israel goes from the spring to the fall, but we had never seen this. And I looked at it and I thought, this has some similarities with, in terms of its structure, with the calendar of Leviticus. Now, usually Leviticus 23, that calendar is considered to be the latest in the Israelite calendar system. It's usually priestly document, and dated into the 6th or 5th centuries BC. So it's considered very late. But as I studied these, I found out that calendar, in terms of its form, the length of months, how much word space is given to special feasts and other feasts, the way in which it's set out, some of the special rituals that are done, the mention of the Zukru festival I already mentioned, and Passover, and in Leviticus, just so many things about it parallel and are closer than any of the other calendars in the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And there's also a calendar in Ezekiel too, but than any of these others. So that if I were looking purely on the basis of its form, and some of the terms and some of the words and the way it's set out, I would say that Leviticus 23 is closer to the multi-month ritual calendar at Emar than any of the other calendars in the Bible. And that would, of course, date it back into the 13th century BC, or a good part of it from that time. Well, that goes against all the theories about cultic calendars and whatnot. Now, there are people who still write on this and they ignore the Amar calendar, but you really have to answer the question. I published an article on it some years ago, and one of my students actually wrote a doctoral dissertation on this subject. So we studied it quite a bit, and I do think that you don't have comparisons between two calendars that are as close anywhere else as between these two, and lasting those 6 or 7 months through the year. So
Incredible.
yeah, yeah. So really, Amar has been, and as I say, it's interesting because now from this 13th century, we have on the one hand we've got the Pentateuch and Moses, the traditional dating for that about that time, and then we have Ugarit that was discovered, and they started publishing that back in the 1930s. And they saw all these myths of Baal and El and Asherah and so forth, and lots of things about that. But none of these types of ceremonial guidelines and instructions and things like this. Then we come to Amar, which was discovered just 40 years ago. That is, it was excavated, and we have there actual examples of these texts. It's much closer to Israel in terms of many of its rituals and other things than Ugarit is. But people are much more familiar with Ugarit because that was the first one discovered. And it's published, and the text that it's published, the many of the texts are written in the alphabetic script, which is similar to Hebrew in a lot of ways. And so it's sort of easier to learn. The Amar material is written in Akkadian. It's a little bit more difficult to study and look at because Akkadian's more difficult and much more of a different language than Hebrew is, whereas Ugaritic's closer. So you have these three, and really now Ugarit is the outlier. It's very different from Israel. But Amar is closer in terms of, and Amar is similar in terms of the culture. It's an agrarian culture, just like Israel. Israel depended a lot on farming and on sheep herding and things like this. Whereas that's true of Amar. It's not true at Ugarit. Ugarit was big into trade, international trade on the Mediterranean as well as in the Middle East. So it's a different culture, and it may reflect some of the connections that the reasons for those that we find here. So just some thoughts there.
Yes, undoubtedly many parallels between those two. But could someone invent all these in Babylonian Persian period, let's say 5th, 6th century, even 7th, to know all these parallels and texts from Imar?
Well, no, is the short answer. Ken Kitchen, who sadly passed away this year, the beginning, that is, I think, February or so of 2025, used to say, well, you have to show me where they had a university department of archaeology in Babylon that could dig up these texts and read them from 1,000 years earlier, or 800 years earlier. So there's a lot of truth to that. You don't just accidentally create so much of this. I mean, for 600 years or more, Amar did not exist. That culture did not exist. And then you have the rise of Babylon. Uh, it, it, there's no easy explanation for that. It's the same way with I've done a lot of study on personal names from from this time and looked, for example, at the names in the book of Joshua, which has a number of Canaanite city leaders and names of those. And I mean, I date Joshua to the 13th century BC. Some people will date it to the 15th century BC. But though there are so many parallels with those names that are found in the 14th century BC Amarna letters. Lachish, the leader of Lachish, is Yaphia, and that's exactly the name in the Bible. Yaphia is a name. It means to brighten or to shine forth. We don't have a name like that in the centuries later. We have names of figures who are what the culture comes and the language comes from the north. The Hurrian names, names of different Hurrian leaders and and kings and even the sons of Anak that are mentioned at that time. Their their names are Hurrian. Hurrian doesn't exist in the area of Israel after the 10th century, and it completely disappears from the Middle East after the 8th century BC. Nobody could. How do you figure out those names to put them, not only to use them, but to use them at the right time and place? And of the right types of people. Um, Somebody tried to argue this and said, well, maybe some later writer had an old scrap of papyrus or something with a bunch of names on it. But really, is that, that seems highly unlikely. And nobody who believes in logic or Occam's razor or finding the simplest and direct answer would agree to that. It involves special pleading. You have to invent something and create it, for which we have no evidence of that sort of thing existing.
Should this be a problem for a Bible believer because we have clearly pagan origins of festivals of Old Testament and other stuff? So is it a problem for you, maybe?
No, it isn't, insofar as I understand that every one of these festivals takes on new and transformed meaning in the Bible. The God's historic act of redemption is nowhere known in the pagan festival, but it's incorporated. The festival is incorporated because the people will remember, and God wants them to remember the barley harvest, and at Pentecost the wheat harvest, because he gives these foods, and then the Feast of Tabernacle. So he uses festivals that have already been or things that are already known and incorporates them in to and for his own purposes. I think there's a little bit similar, and I know there's discussion about this, but Christmas, we most people recognize that Jesus was not born on December 25th or January 6th in Eastern Orthodoxy, but they use these days, having incorporated and transformed their meaning from pagan holidays or festivals. And for most of us, that's not a problem, we don't accept the gods, the false gods, and everything else, but we do accept what Jesus did for us, and we do accept what God has done and did for Israel, as he called upon them to accept that.
Yes. What about linguistic evidence about P source or material or section, how to say? Because I think there are some statistics in your work. I found this.
Yeah, yeah,
So, yeah,
in this Israelite religions book. The
yes.
Yeah, I go through the documentary hypothesis at one point, and I summarize all the arguments against it, and there are a number of important ones. The theory is of this is that you have a J source, so called because of Yahweh. The name Yahweh appears a lot in it, and it's basically a story, a narrative. Begins in chapter 2 of Genesis and goes to the death of well, virtually to the death of Moses and the coming at the entrance of entering into the land. You have an E source which deals with the prophetic narratives and is set in the northern part of Israel. You have the P source for the priestly rituals, which is later. The J source, which is the earliest, is thought to have been written during the time of David or Solomon or one of his successors. And you have the D source, which is thought to have come during the time of Josiah, as a lot of Deuteronomy, which was discovered then, or written then, actually. They see it as a plant. So this documentary hypothesis puts everything late, and it doesn't say, well, this book Exodus is this source. No, JEDP go right through Exodus. Some verses belong to one source, some to another, and so forth. So this is what they do. They pick apart the whole of the Pentateuch in different ways.
Sorry
And
for interrupting, but yes, scholars would say that there is no one story of Exodus. There are many stories, so they are contradictory.
yeah. So the question is there any evidence for this? Well, one of the most important arguments against it, and the first one I give, is that there's no document, there's no scroll, there's no tablet, there's nothing that has ever been found that only has one of these sources in it and not the others. So there's no empirical evidence. Now, it's true that most of what we have in the way of texts and documents begins no earlier than the 2nd century BC. So all this would have been written and presumably already revised into the Pentateuch. But we do have one text from earlier, and that is the silver amulet discovered at Ketef Hinnom, which the Hinnom Valley, you already are familiar with that in the Bible. It's a west side of Jerusalem, and the Ketef Hinnom means the shoulder of Jerusalem as you go up the side. And they were excavating there in what is where the Scottish Presbyterian Church is. And back in the 1970s, 1979, I think it was, they discovered these two silver amulets in a context that dates them to 600 BC. And when they unrolled them, they found that scratched into the amulet was a good part of the blessing of Aaron from Numbers 6, 600 BC. Now, who's Aaron? He's high priest. What source does he belong to? Well, most people would say the priestly source. So his blessing is priestly. So if his blessing is priestly, when were the priestly material written? Well, as I've said before, they were written after the return from the exile. That was in order to recreate a theocratic state in and around Jerusalem under the authority and military rule of Persia. And so 520 BC, 510 BC, 500, who knows, something like that. That's when the priestly documents were written, or even later. Well, how does that work then that the one text that you find dates to 600 BC and is clearly a priestly source? So this calls into question. Now, of course, those who follow the documentary process, well, there's no problem with that. This is just a few words that had a tradition that was widely accepted, and then they wrote it into the priestly document. Well, maybe so, but maybe not. The one place where we can test it, it proves false on the basis of the empirical evidence. The other linguistic evidence is that not only do we have Hebrew written in the Bible from this early period, we also have Hebrew inscriptions. And we now have hundreds of Hebrew inscriptions between the 10th century BC, 11th century BC, even going back that time, right down to the exile and then the return from the exile. We have inscriptions just all through this period. Many of them are securely dated. And as we look at these inscriptions, we can find that there's a change that takes place in the writing of Hebrew, in which Hebrew was written with 22 letters. The letters are all consonants. There are no vowels. You had to fill in the vowels, and that's not unusual for West Semitic scripts at this time and even later. Arabic was written this way later. Syriac, a Christian script of Aramaic, is written this way. Aramaic is Phoenician, all the other Ammonite, Moabite, everything found from this period in alphabetic script. It doesn't have vowels. But in Hebrew, there are a few letters, the Y or Yod, the Vav or W, and and sometimes the H or Hey. These could double as vowels, and they could be written as vowels. And what we find is that there are certain places and contexts, especially within the word, that these vowel letters appear later, but they don't appear earlier. They aren't written as into the words early, and then later on they are written into the words. For example, David, the name David has a Y. It's spelled Dalet Vav Y or Yod Dalet in all later writing. But in the earlier writing, it's not. You don't have that Y. Now they pronounced it the same. They just tended to write the letters a little bit differently, the script a bit differently. So some scholars, Francis Anderson and Dean Forbes, who worked for the Summer Institute of Linguistics, Forbes did. I don't know if he does still, but they examined these. They examined the entire Bible, and just with computers analyzing, and they found that the old-fashioned style of spelling is consistent with the Pentateuch, and that the newer style of spelling, the later style of spelling with the vowel letters written in, is found in the later books, but not in the earlier ones. And you have this gradual change. Statistically, it is significant for the Pentateuch that it is earlier. And there's no difference in what is traditionally called J, E, D, or P. It's all written in this early fashion, this early way. So it is one of the stronger arguments that there was not an original difference between these different sources, that these go back early, and at least in a significant way, they date early. Well, we
Yes,
should,
even Avi Horwitz and Frank Pollack and others would say that P source must be pre-exilic, not
yeah,
after
yeah.
7th century or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, there has been generally a study that in general, and the late now, sadly, he passed away a month or two ago too, Avi Horvitz, but he was one of the leading figures who analyzed what he called late Hebrew, which was post-exilic Hebrew, and earlier Hebrew or standard Hebrew, which was pre-exilic, and found there was a difference there in vocabulary, in language, and other things. And he found that the priestly material was consistent with the earlier Hebrew. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and Daniel Block would say that we don't have epic storytelling like after time of Elijah and Elisha. So Torah is written in that style of before 9th
Yeah.
century. Like, yeah.
Well, it clearly is written in a style, not only in the Bible, but you also have it. I mean, if you're looking outside the Bible in the West Semitic world, you have the story of Idrimi from the 14th century BC, which is he's a West Semitic person. You also have the myths, the Baal cycle from the 13th century BC. So the longest continuous narratives and sources come from the earlier period. You don't have anything like this that we've found yet in the later first millennium BC until you get to the Greco-Roman period in the West Semitic world. Yeah.
Okay, here we are back after a little break, after a month. So previously we talked about the parallels between Emar and biblical festivals, dating the priestly material, etc. So I have more questions for you, Dr. Hess. Was Solomonic temple actually the sanctuary of silence, according to Israel Knoll, who uses this argument to point out that peace source is much older than many scholars think?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think Professor Knoll has a lot of good things to say, and I certainly would sympathize with his concern to see the peace source as an earlier document or set of material that might come from the Iron Age or maybe sources even earlier, as we said with regards to Amar, the 13th century BC. Uh, the whole question of the sanctuary of silence, I think, is an interesting one. There's several items wrapped up in this. First of all, on a broad level, I probably would be very hesitant about seeing the temple as simply a place of silence where nothing went on. You certainly have a sense, if you accept anything in the particularly the first 9 chapters of Chronicles, and then beyond that into First Chronicles, that worship that took place in and around the temple involved music. It involved the proclamation of what I think are, in many cases, recorded for us in the Psalms, especially the first half of the Psalter, and maybe parts of the second half. It involved the use of, as I say, musical instruments, as well as words that were proclaimed and sung. And so I see it as a place where, with almost a certainty, music was done. I also think that in the tradition of later Judaism and even in Israel, the sense of the speaking out of prayers in different times during the day, prayers for different events and opportunities, that also was part of the picture here. And I see no problem with prayers taking place. You do see the wonderful example of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, in 1 Samuel 1 and 2, uh, praising God and praying to God. Now, this is not at the temple, it's at a cult or ceremonial site where Eli was, perhaps at Shiloh, and the tabernacle there before the temple was built. But if already you have people speaking words to God out loud, and perhaps even singing, how much more in the temple when David introduces so many things as the author of many of the Psalms and as a musician himself, and then as the Chronicles details the setting up of them. Now, where I would agree in terms of the emphasis that Knoll makes with regards to silence is that in many, many sanctuaries where we have written records throughout the ancient Near East, and I think especially these written records in Mesopotamia, in the Babylonian temples and elsewhere, there are rituals that are recited to the gods. In fact, in some cases, much like in certain churches, there was a tradition of using, say, for example, Latin as an old language that was used and it seemed to carry some power. And so things were written and spoken and said in prayers and in liturgies in Latin, which even the people could not understand, and therefore it did not so much benefit them. The same sort of thing takes place in these temples in Babylon. You have what are called bilinguals, where you have on the one side the ancient Sumerian, which almost no one, if anyone at all, spoke at that time, and then on the other side the Akkadian that was known and spoken by people, and the priests were given to learn these and to speak out the Sumerian almost as a kind of magical charm or formula that was said to the gods to help guarantee blessing and to achieve whatever purposes the priests and the king behind them had for their activities and their rituals. There is no example of this in in the rituals, in the ceremonies in the temple. Rather, what we have, and this is already suggested in Leviticus, the great book that has so much information about ceremonies and rituals and things that were to be done. What we have there is the first indication that it's written to all Israel. It's called Leviticus in modern terms, but it's not really just to the tribe of Levi. It's to everyone, that they might understand what the sacrifices meant, what they symbolized, what the priests were to do. And in the great day, the Day of Atonement, which is once every year for the forgiveness of all Israel's sins, it's very interesting. We have no directions as to any words that were to be spoken except at one point. And that point is where the high priest confesses the sins of the people on the goat that is sent out, the goat that is sent into the wilderness. And there we are told he is to confess the sins of the people, not in a mysterious language that no one knows, not in secret, but so that the people may witness and bear witness to this. And in fact, I believe in the early days that was heard, but it's the only by the people. But it's the only example we have of mandated or commanded words that are to be said. So I don't think there was a lot of secret. People come to call this in English hocus pocus or mumbo jumbo or whatever you want to call it, that was said or required by the Old Testament and done in the temple. So I'm a bit in agreement with Dr. Knoll with regards to that, but that there was praise and worship and statements that were made and prayers in language that everyone could understand and not hiding it from anyone, I think was certainly going on.
Fascinating. Even in my place in Serbia, we have Orthodox Church, and they usually sing on old Serbian language that nobody understands. So that's interesting, really.
It is, I think, and I think there's always a tendency to do this, even in among those here in the English-speaking world. They want to keep the King James Bible translation. And that's not bad. There's nothing wrong with that in one sense, but it uses an older language, and somehow that becomes sacred in a special way. But it's not. It's not. And so it helps us, I think. It's better that we all understand what what God has for us. I think these things aren't magical. They don't do magical things. So yeah, I would agree.
Yes, also in my place, again, we have an older translation on Serbian from 19th century. So people love that translation because that makes them feel more holy or something like that. So yeah, that's common. Okay, so you wrote commentary on Leviticus, so that's amazing. But I wonder how do you view Holiness Code? Because many scholars would point that this portion is later, centuries after the peace source.
Yeah, I believe there are views like that, and there's a distinction between P and the Holiness Code, which is sometimes called H for holiness. Leviticus, I believe it's mainly Leviticus chapter 17 through 26. And I think it's a very important text. It talks about how to live before God. And of course, it begins with the emphasis on the sanctity of the blood, that the blood represents the life. And this comes right off of Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement, which I think is so important as far as what it has to say, but it shows the importance of the shedding of blood. And in the Old Testament, this was the blood of the animals that was commanded to be shed, of innocent animals, to connect so that that blood might in some way represent the ability to forgive sins, because people, when they committed sin, when they did wrong, they took from God what belonged, which was their life, and used their life for their own purpose rather than for God's. And when they did that, they have a kind of debt to God now that needs to be paid or repaid, and it is life. It is the life that they use, their own life. And so now God says, so there has to be a life given for that, life for life. And so the life of the animals becomes that which represents that. Yeah, and that idea of atonement and of the use of blood and blood sacrifice goes back in the West Semitic world. We even have in 13th century BC Ugarit, a famous text for those who study Ugaritic. There's a famous text there of the whole nation sacrificing and animals being sacrificed at that time for the forgiveness of what some would see as national sins. Much like, or it has been compared to, let's put it that way, Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement. My point there is that the sacredness of blood and its value goes very early. And what we find again and again in these laws is that the laws themselves in the Holiness Code are not post-exilic after the 5th century BC, or even late Iron Age after 700 BC or something like that. The laws and the values and concerns that are expressed in the laws go back earlier. We see this with the Holiness Code when we get to Leviticus 18 and repeated in Leviticus 20. There's a whole collection of things with regards to family and what should be done and not done. Here are laws forbidding adultery, forbidding incest, forbidding bestiality, and forbidding as well homosexual practices, and also forbidding the sacrifice of children to false gods. And all of these together emphasize the value placed on life and the procreation of life within God's accepted order as the family. And we find this going all the way back in Israel in the texts, and with evidence, even in the archaeology, the structure of the so-called four-room house, which begins and becomes, just as Israel enters the land in the 13th century BC and begins to settle down, we have this architecture. And I don't necessarily want to go into a lot of detail about it, but the point is that it's been noted that that architecture and the access to the rooms has similarities to commands about impurity in Leviticus and the menstrual cycle of women, as well as the semen emission of men that might take place. All of this renders a person unclean, and then you have to stay away from others for a certain period of time. And the architecture of the four-room house allows for that with the access points, which you don't find in other houses. And I just give that as an example. But as you look later into the Holiness Code in chapters 18 and 20, you see the way in which the emphasis on the value of the family and the kinship and yes, reproduction and procreation within that family context is guarded. Let's put it that way. The Leviticus 19, which arguably lies at the very center, because I think there's a kind of chiastic structure of these chapters of Leviticus. And Leviticus 19 repeats a lot of the Ten Commandments, commanding the people to be holy, which, again, it depends when you want to date those, but arguably, at least in the literature, the Ten Commandments are presented in Exodus 20 as being at the very beginning of Israel's history. And then at the very center of that, of course, is Leviticus 19:17, which says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So this, one of the great two commandments that Jesus commands and agrees with the Pharisees in the New Testament, the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That loving of your neighbor is found right in the middle of these commands. And so once again we have things that have a deep and abiding heritage in the history of Israel. And I would have no difficulty in seeing these go back very early to even the beginning of Israel's history, rather than see them as later inserts, uh, for which I don't see a strong rationale.
Amazing, but do you see some interconnections between those parts before 17th chapter and Holiness Code? So, do you see some themes or links that bind them together as a one document rather than two, yeah, separate?
No, I think the entire book of Leviticus and even what lies before that is all mapped out in a very, I would say, a logical manner. I mean, you have God giving the basic covenant in Exodus 20 through 23, and then the people all respond by saying, "Yes, we will observe it." And then God has a feast with them or their representatives on the Mount Sinai, Horeb, there in Exodus 24 verses 9 to 11. But he says, in so, not in so many words, but effectively the point is, you can't stay here on the mountain. You can't have this mountaintop experience and that's it. You have to go forward to claim your inheritance, which is the gift of the promised land. So off they go. But before they go, God says, "Look, I will go with you." Therefore, he outlines in chapters 25 to 31 how to build the tabernacle. And that tabernacle is a means by a kind of mobile shrine or mobile tent by which God will go with his people and lead and guide them, and they will be able to worship him moment by moment, day by day, as they travel. And that then sets things in motion. But sadly, the people sin and they worship the gold calf, as you may remember in Exodus 32. And then there's the whole process by which God forgives and is able to connect with them. And chapters 35 to the end of the book of Exodus are really about building that tabernacle and continuing now for God's presence that it will go with them. But it's not just an empty shrine and empty tent. We come to Leviticus and the question arises, well, how will we worship you? What sacrifices will we give? And that's chapters 1 through 7 is the description of the sacrifices and how that will work out for forgiveness of sins, which is people now need because of the sins they committed, for fellowship with God, for celebration, for thanksgiving, for the first fruits and offerings, all kinds of things. But if they're going to have sacrifices, then they need a priesthood to give those sacrifices and to be kind of guiding them, instructing them in the law and direction. So that's chapters 8 through 10, the setting aside and consecration and installation of the priests. And then the question arises, okay, we've got all of these things in place, but how can we now live in a way that will please God so that we don't sin? And what does that look like? And then chapters 11 through 15 describe various ways in which holiness is compromised and in which people are not holy. And but oftentimes these are times that are not the fault of the people. These are just issues like mold that grows onto things, or the giving of birth, or sometimes clean and unclean animals. There's more responsibility there, and how to live in this world that God wants for them. And then chapter 16 says, okay, once a year we want to, while there are opportunities for forgiveness of sin at other times, once a year we certainly want the whole nation to come before God and to repent and to find forgiveness. And that then sets up our understanding for, I believe, chapters 17 through 26, which are, okay, we now have this all in place. What does it mean then to live holy before God? And there's this repetition of being a holy people. You shall be holy because I am holy, which picks up this idea that God is different from others. And yes, there's the importance of love, God's love, which is essential to who he is, balances or is part of that, as well as God's holiness, which says we are different from the nations around us. And this is for our life and for our benefit. And the whole Holiness Code then teaches us about that, teaches us about the importance of blood and how that should be handled, which is the sacredness of life, teaches us about what it means to be a holy people, loving of others, the idea of special what should be done in Leviticus 23 with regards to the ceremonies and festivals, celebrating special days during the entire year, and what that looks like so that the people can continue to walk with God and be with him. So all of the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 through 26 sort of develops out this theme of what it means to be holy, which starts in the tabernacle and the priests and the sacrifices, and then moves out to the rest of the people of God and their worship of him. So those are some thoughts.
Beautiful, Dr. Hess. So now, can we talk about the source about Book of Deuteronomy? Some scholars point to similarities between Neo-Assyrian treaties from the 7th to 9th century BCE and the structure of the Book of Deuteronomy, even suggesting that these connections are stronger than those with the Hittite treaties from the 14th to 12th century BCE. Even if they're not stronger, there are parallels, so we have to cover all quotations, allusions, echoes of those treaties, not just the main ones. So if we want to explain all parallels, then it must be written Book of Deuteronomy after Hittite treaties, but also after Neo-Assyrian. How do you answer on this?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting argument. I've certainly heard it many times. It's, yeah. So let's go back to this and kind of look at this for a minute in terms of understanding. First of all, there are many treaties. If you listen to the podcast here where Nemanji interviewed Dr. Hoffmeyer, he pulls out Ken Kitchen's big volumes and says there's actually Ken Kitchen, the late Ken Kitchen, put together about 100 treaties between the 24th century BC, 25th, and down to the 1st century BC, coming out or connected with the ancient Near East and its culture. And those are only the ones that have been discovered and that were discovered when he wrote that a couple decades ago. Now, there are even more, but lots of. So when two countries wanted to get together and have a relationship like today, they would draw up a treaty and down through history, and that treaty then would define what that relationship would look like. Nothing surprising about that. There were two major types of treaties throughout all of this history. One was where you had two kind of equal, often superpowers, where there was kind of an equality, like between Egypt and the Hittites, or Egypt and Babylon, or something like that. And they would draw up what often is called a parity treaty of equals. And then there was those where you had one kind of superpower conquering a smaller power, and they would draw up what is called a suzerain vassal treaty. The suzerain being the emperor or the big guy in charge of the big power, and the vassal being often the king. Sometimes, in one or two examples, the people more broadly, but the king and maybe some of his closest family and group. And they would define that relationship. And this has all been studied. In fact, I think it was an individual from Czechoslovakia in 1940 named Karoshek, who put together and analyzed a group of these treaties called the Hittite treaties and the vassal treaty structure. He found that several dozen of these treaties were very similar in their structure and this only occurred in the 14th and 13th century BC. They had a title where the main guy, the sovereign, the emperor of the stronger party identifies himself. They had a historical prologue where they went through and described past relationships between the superpower and the vassal. And the emphasis there was to show that when the vassal was loyal to the superpower in the past, good things would happen to the vassal, and the superpower would take care of him, take care of the vassal. And then there are all the stipulations, which are the detailed laws as to what they should and shouldn't do. This often reflects on loyalty, like if somebody escapes from the Hittite emperor and flees to this country, they should return this figure back to the Hittite emperor, and this sort of thing, so that what it meant to be loyal to the emperor. And then there was, after that, there was a list of witnesses. These were often the gods and goddesses of the two countries that would be called upon and invoked. Their names would be invoked. And so it was thought a certain power was called upon them to bear witness to this treaty. So if anybody disobeyed, particularly the vassal, they would know and they could inflict punishment on him. And then there was also curses and blessings that would appear. There would be if you obeyed, you were blessed, and you would be your land would be blessed, and perhaps most importantly for the vassal, he would be guaranteed succession. That when he died, his successor, his family member that he chose, would be the next person in line to rule. And then curses if you didn't follow, if you were disobedient, if you made treaties with other countries other than the sovereign and started connecting with them, then you were really in trouble. And the curses actually over time became more and more bigger and bigger and more colorful. Okay, so that was the Hittite treaty structure. And it's very interesting. So keeping that in mind, people have studied the later treaties of the Neo-Assyrian period from the 9th century to the 7th century BC. And they found that many of these items are still there, but without exception, and we've got dozens of these, so we can say this with a fair amount of certainty because it's probably not just chance. Without exception, there's no historical recollection, no historical prologue or whatever you want to call it, and there are no blessings. The Assyrians they weren't such nice people, so there are no blessings there for keeping it, but there sure are curses there if you don't. So lo and behold, in the 1950s, George Mendenhall, the University of Michigan, took Karoshek's analysis and applied it to the book of Deuteronomy and to some other places, but especially to Deuteronomy. And he found Deuteronomy really works very similarly. Okay, you've got the first 5 verses giving the initial identification of the Lord God as the emperor and Moses as being kind of a spokesperson for him. And so suddenly what's happened is this geopolitical document now has been transformed by God to define a relationship between him and his vassal. And who's his vassal? Well, it's Israel. It's the whole nation of Israel. And so they looked at Deuteronomy and they found, yep, there's that initial identification of the Lord God as the speaker and Moses as giving the words of God. And then from chapter 1 on through chapter 3, you really have a historical prologue. You have the whole history of Israel from when it was at Mount Sinai 40 years before until it arrived at Mount Nebo and Abel Beth Shittim, as it says in Numbers. That's where they wound up. Now, it's not a detailed history, and it's not just history for random knowledge. It's specifically choosing incidents which emphasize that when Israel was loyal to God, just like the historical prologue did, when the vassal was loyal to the sovereign, blessings happened, good things happened, God blessed them. When they were disloyal, like when they rebelled at Kadesh Barnea and refused to go in, that's also mentioned, because then God did not allow that generation to go into the land, and they all died in the desert. So it's a history to motivate the readers of Deuteronomy to obey God and to be faithful. Then, beginning in chapter 4 and 5 especially, with the Ten Commandments, and 6 with the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and on through chapter 26 or so of Deuteronomy, you have all these detailed stipulations or laws. This is what it means to be loyal to God. And a lot of it does directly relate to loyalty to God. If you read chapters 4 through 12 or 13, you really see that. And then there's more detailed laws that show the setting up of the society and other aspects of it. But this fits right where you would expect these stipulations in the vassal treaty, the suzerain vassal treaty. I just call it vassal treaty for sake of brevity. But okay, so we got this vassal treaty, we've got the stipulations. Now, what about the witnesses? And of course, you remember the witnesses were all the gods and goddesses of the two. Well, there's only one God in Israel's belief, and it's the God of Israel. And he's making the treaty. So he's on the one side. He is the sovereign. So it doesn't do to call different gods and goddesses, because Israel was taught not to believe in them. And that would be a direct contradiction. But in chapter 30 and elsewhere, there are witnesses. There are things called witnesses. One of them is the actual poem that Moses teaches the people. It's like a little song so that they could remember and sing it to be loyal to God, there in 31 especially. And so that's a witness. Another witness is the actual words of the law, which he writes down, and then it's placed within the sanctuary. And that's another witness that the people are called upon, because the words themselves speak out to them. And then a third witness is heaven and earth, which are called to bear witness there in chapter 30. Now, heaven and earth here are not gods and goddesses like they were believed by some of the nations round about. But what it means, and that flows right into the blessings and cursings, is that if Israel follows God and is loyal to God, the heavens will rain down the rain that gives fruitfulness to the land, and the earth will produce the crops, and they will live securely in the land that God is giving them. And if they don't, if they disobey, then that will not happen. And there will be droughts, and there will be lack of food, and the people eventually will be thrust out of the land. And that is, by the way, what we find in chapter 28. Chapter 28 details for us in the first 15 verses the blessings that the people will enjoy. And then from verse 15, 16, on to the rest of that chapter, which is a pretty long chapter, it details the curses that will come if the people disobey, just like the Hittite vassal treaty. And unlike the later Assyrian treaties, because the Assyrian treaties have no historical prologue, so what's chapters 1 to 3 of Deuteronomy doing at the beginning of that book? And if it's late from that time, and they have no blessings. So what's chapter 28, verses 1 to 15 doing if it shouldn't be there? if it's made to resemble a Neo-Assyrian vassal treaty. Now, a lot of time and ink has been spent in studying the curses that are found, and there's a lot of them, in chapter 28, the latter part of chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. and particularly the Neo-Assyrian treaty curses, especially those of a treaty made by Esarhaddon with people to the east in around Babylonia. And it's been shown a number of these curses are similar. But others have noted that these same themes of some of the curses, and indeed some very different curses that don't appear in Esarhaddon, but do appear in Deuteronomy, are also found earlier, and they're found back in the Hittite period. So careful study of this material does not seem to me to support, on the basis of its form or even its contents, that this is something that some Israelite scribes borrowed in the 9th or 8th century, or later, when they had contact with Assyria, and copied into a, probably most critics would say, a 7th century book of Deuteronomy, which they then planted in the temple for Josiah to find. And when King Josiah found it, then he instituted this revolution. And he himself may have been behind it, according to some of these scholars, because they're arguing he put it together. Now, others will say, no, actually, the whole thing is later than that even, and goes into the post-exilic period. That seems even less likely, on the basis of we just don't have that many documents from that time. Where and how did they get this idea of a vassal treaty? And you have the same arguments as I gave earlier. Where and how do you have the historical prologue, and where and how do you have the blessings? And why do you have this in just so much similarity in terms of the same structure, and even some of the same ways in which they're written? For example, the blessings and curses in the Hittite vassal treaties often mirror one another, at least in part of it. They say, if you follow this treaty, you will be blessed in the country, you will be blessed in the city, you will be blessed, your wives will be blessed, your children will be blessed, and so forth. And then they say, if you don't follow this, you will be cursed in the country, you will be cursed in the city, you will be cursed, your family will be cursed. And it's a mirror image. And if you look at Deuteronomy 28, that's how Deuteronomy 28, 1 to 15 goes. And then the next 5 or 10 verses after that on the curses, they're mirror images of that. So many of these things, where do they come from? Well, if you're not trying to make an argument for a late date for Deuteronomy, and you simply compare the forms, it's very hard to get around the argument that the form of Deuteronomy fits with the 13th century BC vassal treaties of the Hittites that by archaeology, we happen to have preserved the treaties of the Hittites that they made with other nations. You could probably the same thing was going on in some of the other superpowers like Egypt and Babylon, but we just don't have those preserved for us. But whereas returning to the figure of Ken Kitchen, as he would say, where did the Israel in the 7th century have a university and a department of archaeology to dig up these treaties and to work out where 600-700 years earlier that they should write in this form, because it doesn't appear later. So there are some thoughts. There are also other elements of the treaties we could talk about. The deposition of the treaty itself in the temple, like in chapter 30, the tablets are put into the temple of the Lord, and the public reading of the material on a periodic basis, which again in Deuteronomy 30, Israel is commanded to read out loud every 7 years the entire covenant that they have. And this is also found in the Hittite treaty material. So it is known elsewhere, and it all conforms with this early date that we would argue for.
Wow, amazing answer. I didn't know that last part. That's quite striking. So, Joel Baden and John Collins would say that we have quotations of some words or themes, like in Vassal Treaty of Esarhaddon, we have you shall add nothing to and take nothing away from this text. So we have also that in Deuteronomy. Also, Shema Israel in Deuteronomy 6. We have in Vassal Treaty Esarhaddon, you shall love my son Ashurbanipal. So something like Assyrian emperor would say, you are to love me and my son, and that means actually don't go making treaties or alliances with other kings. So is God something like vassal and doing some references to Esarhaddon treaty or not? Do we have parallels with earlier treaties on this?
Thank you for that question. This is a book that came out a few years ago, and I wanted to draw attention to it. 2017, it appeared. It's a book edited by Dan Block and Richard Schultz, and it's called Sefer Torah Moshe, Studies in the Composition and Interpretation of Deuteronomy. And this book contains in it two, I think, very important essays, one by Neil Huddleston and one by Lawson Younger and Neil Huddleston. Now, in these two chapters that I wanted to call to your attention, they do criticize some of the points that are made by some of those who argue for an earlier date, such as Ken Kitchen and his big volume. So they are not trying to simply say everything's right and okay, and we're just following. But in their study, they also, and particularly Neil Huddleston does this, he also dates and examines the curses. And he has sort of all kinds of charts. You can see this sort of chart here, where he goes through and actually discusses the glosses, the comparison of Esarhaddon's treaty and the curses of Deuteronomy. And his conclusion is that as you compare these, one of the original scholars has left out, this would be Moshe Weinfeld, who really developed this connection and similarity, has left out material that might bring his thesis into question. And he goes through and pulls out how again and again the wording is not the same, and how Deuteronomy only has no more than a passing resemblance, as he calls it, to the Esarhaddon text. And so he examines the actual Akkadian or Assyrian in the text and what we have from the earlier periods. And his conclusion is that indeed what we have is clear evidence that there is earlier material in the Hittite and other early examples, and that what we have in the Esarhaddon text is, as he says, no more than a passing resemblance. So I just want to bring this out. There's ongoing study with regards to this, and there has been before this a scholar named Marcus Zander in the Bulletin for Biblical Research, published about 15, 20 years ago, where he made a number of arguments and showed word-for-word parallels with the Hittite treaties. And so this continues to move us forward, but the conclusions of similarities with the Esarhaddon treaties can no longer stand as it once did. And it needs now to be called into question and to be re-examined. So I would call these books to your attention and encourage that if people wish to, they follow up with these studies because they are very important, and it gets us more into details and specific phrases and texts. There's nothing in the Esarhaddon treaty structure that is not so distinctive as to pull it into the later period. I mean, as to pull the Deuteronomy curses into that later period.
Thank you so much. And about other part of question, sorry, it was longer, but it represents God as a vassal, a king. So is that?
Yeah, no, I think it actually represents God, yeah, as not the vassal, but as the sovereign again and again. As I argue with regards to the Hittite treaty structure, God is the sovereign, and He is actually giving to His people the land as a response to their entering into that covenant with them. So I don't see God as anything less than a sovereign. I think what is remarkable that this overall study shows is a transformation of this medium of communication from a geopolitical document between an overlord and a vassal, which had no real direct religious implications in terms of theology. A transformation of that, which, as far as I know, still Israel is the only nation to do this, I believe, led by God, to make it into a means by which God would relate to his people. Because no other God in the ancient world does this. No other God relates to all the people. In some cases, a God will relate to the king in a special way, and the king will claim to have a special relationship. They're even in their names, like Tzilim Marduk means the image of Marduk. Well, like he is the image of that god, this king, the god Marduk. Well, as you know from Genesis 1, God created all people in his image. So we all are image bearers, which is an entirely foreign concept. It gives a certain equality and basis for that relationship between God and his people. And as a suzerain, he loves his people and wishes them only to be strong and to really have a relationship with him, which is founded on principles of equality and relationship like that. There is a book which I would recommend, came out a few years ago by Joshua Berman, a Jewish scholar in at Bar Ilan University, the Orthodox university in Israel. It's called Created Equal: How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought. And this goes through point after point, and it shows in remarkable ways the unique aspects, of which there were these, as well as the common aspects of the people. But there is much more of a sense of the importance of the people as a whole before God, and the opportunity of all people to worship God together and to know God on a personal level, which really is not known and available to the average person outside of Israel.
Yes, thank you. And also, what is your comment on idea that Deuteronomy would say something like don't add or subtract anything from the text, but Deuteronomy itself is quoting from that specific verse. So Joel Baden say essentially, don't do to me what I did to these earlier texts. So what's your thought?
No, I think that the point of Deuteronomy is to set in place an absolute covenantal relationship, which does indeed expand on the earlier texts, but it wants to make clear that you don't create, this is not then optional to create additional laws or to remove them. And in fact, this is the whole point that that going back to the vassal treaty with the Hittites and others, why did they put it in the temple? Because the temple was the safest place for the treaty. It not only has that sense, well, you don't want to come in here and mess around because the god, you'll interfere with the god and make them angry. But the temple was also the place which was the most guarded. It was the most secure. I remember in my study of classical archaeology, the Parthenon in Greece, in Athens, was where the wealth of Athens was on display in the gold statues of the goddess and everything else. And it was kind of the bank, the depository. And that's true in the ancient world. It's where the gifts and all the wealth of that nation, or much of it, was kept because it was the safest place for it to be. Same way with the treaty. The idea was you couldn't go in and change the wording to make it benefit you. Either in the vassal, because two copies were made. One was kept in the Hittites, with the Hittites as the sovereign, and the other was placed in the temple, the holy temple of the vassal. And that's the same idea here. And that's why you shouldn't add or subtract anything from it. Yeah, indeed, the words were developed. In fact, you can argue, as others have, going back in modern times to Stephen Kaufman in the 1980s, and then before that, 100 years before that, to Schmidt and others, who noted that you take the Ten Commandments, which are presented in Deuteronomy 5, and it's really an outline of Deuteronomy 6 through 26. That order and what they focus on, you can trace through the rest of the chapters of Deuteronomy and the laws. And I think that's exactly right. And that goes back to Exodus 20. And for sure, what they did was they took that law and they built on it. But that isn't to give the average person or anybody else the right to add and subtract from those laws, because those were, as Israel understood it, the very words of God, their sovereign, who instructed them as to how they might live. So I don't put a lot of stock in what Baden says, because I think you will find, and indeed some of these laws go back to Hammurabi, some of the more civil laws and legislation and things like this. And it is simply true that the law code does develop between that presented in Exodus and that in Deuteronomy. But there is an intentionality to that, which then, when it is closed there in Deuteronomy, it becomes God, the expression of God's will. And yeah, I don't see that as a problem.